I'd like to thank Natalie, Hudson, and Gabriela, Shalev, and Hiba Husseini for three really very rich presentations, uh, characterized by unusual frankness and candor, which is, by the way, these days extraordinarily refreshing. We going to open the floor for discussion. I have one request, and that is it's a little warm outside. Not lectures, please. And if they are, I'll stop them. Okay? So this is a chance for dialogue and for discussion. Who wants to be second? We need the microphones because session is being recorded, and just introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Shiri.
Shiri, you have a last name too.
Shiri Bar. I have two questions. One, I'm curious to know if there were ever, on the Israeli side in the negotiations, if there were women except for Tzipi Livni. Never heard about it. And the other thing, there is just continuing from the last lecture, there are today in the world, there are peace ministries in some places, and there are campaigns to open peace ministries in about 45 countries. And I think this is a great opportunity to combine women, peace, security issues under a peace ministry. It's kind of like, it should have been the second question and not the first one. But I think it's something we need to consider, because if we have a peace ministry and the peace minister that should be a woman is sitting in the security cabinet, etc., then we are there at the table to discuss the political and important issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hold on those for a minute, and let's take a few more, and we'll do a couple of rounds. Can you pass the mic to Tamir, Dr. Magal?
Hi, I'm Tamir Magal. Sorry. I will begin with a short lecture with the question. The question.
Academics.
I would like to challenge the idea of women's inclusion with the example of Northern Ireland, where the women were included in the process, and women's articles related to women's issue were included in the peace agreement, but in the end, the implementation was not as expected.
Where is that?
Northern Ireland. And the question is inclusion and does articles in the agreement enough to get the results we want?
Okay, for those of you who didn't hear the question is, Northern Ireland's situation or example is not a very strong one. Can you rethink this insistence on inclusion of women? How do we know it's really going to make a difference? Is that the question?
It did make a difference in the formal sense, but in the end, coming to implementation on outcome, on the process, it wasn't good enough.
Okay. Very good questions. Anybody else at this stage? Okay, Sarai, you can ask a question and then answer the first question of Shiri.
Sarai Aroni, I have a question to Hiba Husseini. I would like you to think a little bit, if possible, to talk about, from a Palestinian perspective, what would be a women's issue to put on the table? And I'm referring to the issue of family rights, unification, but possibly other issues. I would like to ask you about this specifically, whether you see a possibility of including a women's issue from the Palestinian. And the same question goes to Gabriela Shalev, I guess, as an Israeli representative. And yes, there were Israeli women in negotiations during the 1990s. We managed to count a few women. Many of them were administrative assistants, secretaries, which had a very important task within these negotiations, and I think that we should recognize that as well. But we also had legal advisors and economic advisors and negotiators, mid-level negotiators that nobody heard about and nobody knows about, and that's really time for us to know that these people were there. And Hiba probably met some of them, but they were really there. They were out of public sight and still are out of public sight.
Thank you, Sarai. Dr. Aroni wrote her PhD on Israeli women in the Oslo process, and I must admit I was privileged to be one of her supervisors, so I can give you the numbers in my sleep. I suggest that we give each one of the speakers a chance, really, if you can, 2-3 minutes to answer these questions and get yourself a little more excited with more questions. I think, Gabby, why don't we start with you, please? Professor Shalev.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's true that only Tzipi Livni was at the top of the negotiations. She still is. But I think there are women in all levels, as was mentioned. There is now a group of women, the Forum Deborah, which makes it their agenda to put women in very important positions and push women, for example, to the Tirkel Commission, which was inquiring into the Mavi Marmara, the Turkish flotilla, Shalom Anat, not always successful. The idea of the peace ministry, which is a great one, I have to think about it. The example of North Ireland, I don't have much to say about it, but the question that was asked regarding women's issues in the conflict, this is exactly what I wanted to ask you, Hiba. Do women's or gender issues are in some way mentioned in the peace negotiations? Because I know that we, for many, many years, we, Israeli women and Israeli public, we used to think that as security and peace are so important that feminist and gender issues should be pushed aside. First of all, we have to solve the big problems, and then we get back to the side problems, which is, you know, women's rights, human rights. I know now, and many of us know now, that it cannot be disentangled. This is one whole issue or problems, and the puzzle which Hiba so articulately mentioned of all the issues that are on the table between us and the Palestinians, each of them has a women's or gender perspective. But I think you should refer to it.
Well, thank you. On this very particular issue, unfortunately, in the structure of the issues, as we both sides structure the issues, women's issues don't come up at all as a women's rights issue or gender issue. It's not even on the list of issues. The only way it comes up is simply in the discussion of mothers and prisoners and humanitarian, but it's even the context of humanitarian law on gender and women's issue is not part of the agenda items at all. And I think it's also partly the failing of us women who participate. I, for one, don't know the issues, so I cannot bring them up. So when I set the issues up for my legal committee for discussion, I am totally ignorant of women's issues in terms of the formality that I should be bringing them up. And so I have...
I said don't feel bad.
No, I don't feel bad. I have failed, and I have a lot of learning to do in that respect. We tend to stick to the core issues. Sticking to the core issues is hard enough, let alone bringing up the issue of women. I mean, can you imagine how we can bring up the issue of women in security? It's very important, but how can you even table it? You can't table certain core issues, let alone coming up with women issues. So this is going to be a major challenge for us on both sides. To her credit, Tzipi Livni, during the Annapolis process, created a committee on the culture, culture of peace. Culture of peace. I was not part of that committee, and I don't know all the issues that were discussed, but at least I think she had some sort of an awareness of the culture of peace that we need to discuss and so forth and so on. I don't know to what extent they discussed women's and gender issues, but at least she moved a little bit farther away from the security and the borders and so forth and so on.
Do you want to add something?
I'll just. Is this working? Yeah.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay.
It's on.
Well, good enough. So, I would just sort of build upon your comments and Tamir's question with regard to is inclusion enough? And I think what we need one of the things to think about with regard to inclusion is not just whether or not the women that are included, do they represent women's issues or women's voices or women's organizations for that matter, but do they have influence in the context in which they're actually participating, right? So inclusion can take many different shapes and many different forms, and whether or not they're taken seriously in the inclusion, I think also matters. What I do think is important in this inclusion is that in bringing women into the conversation, there is opportunity there to creatively to expand the discussion beyond women to gender and to connect the ways in which the causes of a conflict have gendered components. Now, they're not all gendered, I don't believe, actually, but there are a lot of pieces that we can look at, and even the data that you presented at the beginning, why is that, why do men feel the way that they do with regard to, the most important values or the guiding principles, and how much of that is tied to what it means to be a man, a male identity, and so in opening that discussion, right, about gender, we can have a deeper conversation and a more sustainable conversation about, well, in changing, in addressing these issues that you've put forth, how does that threaten a man's existence, right, and his identity, his place in his community, and so what can we do to better approach that and deal with that in real ways, and not to sort of push it off as a soft issue, but something is very relevant, central to the finding a solution.
Just a very brief commentary to pick up on the answers here is really, really intriguing what representation means and gender representation means in the context of peace negotiations, because we've heard two very different formulations actually here. One is, let's talk about women's issues and gender inequality. Let's add and expand the list of issues on the agenda to incorporate new questions that haven't been addressed and are not automatically addressed because of the composition. That's one approach. And the second approach, which I admit I have a very strong bias towards lately, is what about the gender perspective on each one of the issues? And just imagine, we had here 2 weeks ago one of the most fascinating discussions on gender perspectives on Jerusalem. And I must admit that I'm a little jaded. It's a function of having been around for a while. I must admit, people sat here and they wouldn't leave because it was so fascinating. By injecting gender perspectives into existing issues and reframing them in such a way that they could have relevance to much broader and diverse segments of the population is a very different approach. And by the way, frankly, I happen to think that the two approaches are not mutually exclusive, and when one brings them together to the table, they can really be extraordinarily powerful. But that's a comment that I couldn't resist. And I won't talk anymore. I'd be happy if anybody else wants to intervene or ask questions. At this point, we'll have one last round because I've promised I did promise to begin on time, but I did promise to end on time.
I'm Siobhan Byrne, University of Alberta. I have a question about
Much louder, nobody heard you.
Siobhan Byrne, University of Alberta. I have a question about the role of the international community. It seems like there's sort of two tracks. There's one of the shuttle diplomacy, assistance in backroom kind of negotiations, the things that have to take place in private to help negotiators stick to those core issues that we saw today. There's also the 1325 track, which is to think about the inclusion of women. And Natalie, you spoke about not just the inclusion of women, but civil society. So that would seem to me that it is a commentary also on process, that it would be one, if it's to be inclusive of civil society, that couldn't take place in backroom diplomacy. It would have to be something that would be open and that there might be more participation. I'm wondering, I guess the one thing I hear from colleagues who work on negotiations is that that's not possible. It's not possible to have any discussion. Things have to be agreed to in private before it can be opened up to the public. So I'm wondering whether there's ways of thinking about a peace process looking quite different to incorporate these issues.
I see one more. That's okay.
My name is Hazar. My question is to Professor Natalie. My question is connect to your lecture and what you said in the end that actually I agree with you that women need to change their position and they need to be seen different than we usually seen as tradition as mothers and but how I understand things that women need to be involved more in security issues in order to come and go further and be in positions to be involved more in negotiations as to see in Tzipi Livni's. Yes. And this means that women still are not representing the issues that we needed to be represented in the peace negotiations, like to represent real issues that women need to be to deal with, not like security issues. I don't know if I'm right, if you understand my question, but so I think that in the end, if this is the way that women will come to the negotiations through being involved in security background, so they won't have any change, like how we see now. I mean, Ms. Hiba Husseini said there is no any issues related to women are in the core issues now. So this means that women that now are involved are not presenting things relevant to gender issues. So how you think we can judge? And I agree with you.
Thank you. One last question from Professor Peters. Joel, to your left.
That's Joel Peters from Virginia Tech. I want to pick up on Zan's comment. I want to pick up on Zan's comment about changing the agenda to ask the panel about the issue of representation and how much when women enter negotiations they have to kind of prove themselves that they can play the male game, that they are as good as their male counterparts to be in the room, which restricts the actual change the agenda because they need to show that they know as much about the fixed security as a man can do it just as well.
Well, of course we do.
No,
Uh,
how much does that impact is when you're in the room?
Yes, okay.
Have the process.
Okay, we will go now in reverse order, Natalie, and then Hiba and Gabi, wrap up.
Okay,
Right.
thanks. So I think I'll defer the question on whether or not it's possible to hold negotiations that are open to the public and civil society to participated in those. And I'll be anxious to hear their answer. In terms of your question, actually, it piggybacks quite nicely with the third question. Women seem to be able to enter these spaces in decision making either as the peacemakers, right, and the nurturers of society, or because they have this military experience that enables them to be enough to participate. And yet there's nothing sort of in the middle. One of the most powerful things that I've seen come out, I think, of the Women, Peace, and Security resolutions, and there are lots of reasons to be critical of them, but one of the things that I've seen is that the dialogue around these resolutions, both men and women participating in them, even those that are resistant to it, has enabled a discussion about what we mean by security to broaden a bit, right? And so challenging sort of a traditional notion of security that's based on borders, military, and territory to something of that broadens us, the understanding of security, something that includes economic security and food security and all sorts of other realms of security as well. So sort of broadening it to include other issues, but also deepening it to think about security of individuals as opposed to just security of the state, and security of regions as opposed to just security of the state. And so I think there are some really opportunities there that for women's activism to push that.
Well, I think, in terms of holding negotiations in public versus private, I think there are issues for the public to be aware of and participate in a consultative approach, which has not been the case, at least on the Palestinian side. Private is the preferred option, and I would recommend that because of the sheer complexity of the issues. And you cannot conduct negotiations in public. There are a lot of issues that have to be discussed over and over in private in order to at least even broach them, let alone reach an agreement on them. But I think a consultation with the public on the issues has been missing, I dare say on both sides, but like Jerusalem, like refugees and so forth. On the issue of whether we feel we need to prove ourselves professionally, I think I alluded to that. There's some of that, for sure, especially when you're younger. As you grow older, in terms of your experience and exposure, you don't do that anymore. You just simply do it as a woman. But I think because you're so alone, you tend to fall into that trap immediately. Not so much that I know as much as the males. That wasn't the way I was approaching it. I know the issues just as well. I had to reach that level where I was comfortable with the issues so that I can argue and hold my ground, basically. But I'm sure if I were to really think about it going back 20 years ago, I'm sure that was the case.
Thank you.
I think I can relate both to the first question and then to the last one, the one about, this is something that I learned, backroom diplomacy, and the one about the male game. I can attest from my own experience as representing a country that is the enfant terrible of the world, which is delegitimized, and most of the members of the General Assembly do not want to be seen speaking with us in public. It so happened that most of my discussions and negotiations, if they took place, well, here it comes backroom diplomacy, behind the scenes. I met many Arab ambassadors, representatives, of course, countries that do not have any diplomatic relations with Israel. And I think it brought in their wake some good results. I want to say something as a woman and as a feminist. I had a wonderful, friendly relationship with the American ambassador, Susan Rice, who is now the advisor of security to President Obama. By the way, she was replaced by a woman, Samantha Power. And this kind of friendship amongst women, although different in age, you mentioned age, I told her that she is a little older than my elder daughter. But still, we became very, very close friends, and I think it was useful, to say the least, for the American-Israeli relationship, which of course is at the back of the negotiations that at that time also did not take place in public between us and the Palestinian Authority. And I think we women, this is my last comment, Naomi, we women are in a much better situation to further negotiations. I saw it at the UN, the kind of friendship and sisterhood amongst women. It was not only Susan Rice, it was many women ambassadors, not as many, but we had a caucus of women. We met, we discussed many things. Of course, children, grandchildren, but also security, peace, negotiations, diplomatic relations. And I think being a woman in the global arena, also where the majority is male, gives us a privilege. It's not an obstacle, but it's a privilege and something that we can build on because of everything that was mentioned here, the way that women should react, negotiate, and relate to each other, to men and to women. And with this,
I'd like to really thank our speakers. They've been magnificent and open and honest, really. And to thank you all for coming and to remind you, those who don't remember, even though I mentioned it at the beginning, that there will be a full day of discussions tomorrow on this topic under the auspices of the Davis Institute at the Hebrew University, taking place at Bet Meyersdorf at the Faculty Club on Mount Scopus. You're all invited. Have a good evening, and I wish everything that was said here can be heard by every single man and woman in the region. Thank you very much.